Dr. Andrea Siodmok is a senior civil servant at the Cabinet Office responsible for Policy Lab, the Open Innovation Team and Skyroom's network of innovation spaces, a trained industrial designer with a first-class degree in industrial design, PhD in virtual reality and Masters in Public Policy from the London School of Economics. Her multi-award-winning work has received significant acclaim in the UK and overseas. Launched at the beginning of April 2014, the Policy Lab is a creative space where civil servants can experiment with new techniques and approaches to policy problems from data science to design. Its existence is born of a recognition that government needs to get better at policy making, open it up, make it quicker, more digital and more connected with the people who are affected by it. Andrea is passionate about expanding the boundaries of design practice. She was an early proponent of service design and has been a champion for public involvement in designing better public services.
All right, yeah. Can I extend a further thanks for coming this morning on your Saturday mornings when I know you could be having brunch and chilling out in the sunshine. Did anyone see my previous talk a couple of years ago here? Yes? Okay. Well, you'll be pleased to know this is different. So in the Policy Lab, one of the things that we do is we always put something new into every workshop so that we're learning and we don't just kind of turn into a machine that just does the same old, same old. It's not only new, but I haven't shared this with anyone publicly. So you're getting, in a sense, I think, a bit of a prototype presentation. So if it's a little bit rough around the edges, that's because I want to share with you my emerging thinking rather than giving you something that's very, very polished. So in the spirit of design, this is kind of where my thinking is at in terms of systems thinking, organisational change, and built on the last 6 years of working in the Policy Lab in the UK government. And for those of you who don't know, as Jack said, we're a really small team. We originally had 1 year to prove ourselves, to bring design and digital and data science techniques into the UK government. And we started with 1 member of staff and 1 year. And after that year, we were able to kind of push things forwards, had a really successful first year. We just got practical, we did some projects. And now 6 years in, we're about 15 people based in the Treasury in the UK government. And we've done maybe 50 or 60 projects for the Prime Minister in different departments. So everything from space security and what happens if you lose the satellites, through to social housing and things like refugee integration. So a real spectrum of projects from all technology and industrial strategy right the way across. In fact, what we've found so far, which has been curious to me, is that there have been no bounds to design. And we've been able to take design methods, and sometimes we adapt them, but fundamentally, we have yet to find a policy project that design has not added value to in some way. Now, there's a whole other talk about how design might add value and how you might measure its impact, but I'm not going to give you that one. I'm just going to really give you, as I say, some initial thoughts and musings about complexity and systems and how, perhaps as a designer, both Sanjan and I operate within these really big, complex organisations. So the other tiny point, just as a framing really, is that we have this team in the UK government. We can work, there are 400,000 people working in the UK government, and we're trying to affect change in 20,000 policymakers. But we don't kind of just stop there. We also work with other governments and other organisations outside, and we see our role, which I'll come up into in the talk, about acting across systems, not just within systems. And so, for example, we've recently been working with the United Nations in New York and helping them to be more agile and more innovative, and other governments as well. So one of the things I first discovered when I got into government was described to me by a department which will remain nameless as we're on camera, which is that departments, and you could say this of most organisations, are a bit like jelly. You push them to change, they wobble a bit, and then they go back exactly as they were before. So how do you make change stick? How do you kind of, I always think, make a trifle? You know, just smash up the jelly, add the cream, you know, just sprinkles on the top, the whole lot. So much of this narrative, if you like, is about disruption. And yet, people don't want to be disrupted, so how can we make that fun and pleasurable thing? Is that my timer at the front? It's gone off, so just in case you would need to keep the time. And also, how long do you want me to talk for? I'm going to do 20, and then Sanjan will do 20. So just so you know when it's going to end. Please make this end. Right, so organisations, a lot like jelly, but how can we make it more fun when we disrupt them? We in the lab talk about going with the grain. So we don't see ourselves as being sort of fixing people or fixing processes or fixing organisations. We see ourselves as helping and supporting and catalysing, and a very optimistic and positive approach to change. And you'll know this. There's a vast and fascinating literature behind some of this work, and these are just some of the books that we've been reading and interested in, and some of the thinking that you'll see in my talk really come from these. And, you know, they all have one thing in common, and that is colourful covers. The top left one was written by an economist, and as was the bottom right one, but, you know, in between we have designers. So whether you're in economics, or whether you're in design or social change, if you're talking about this stuff, you're going to put a rainbow on it. Because it's fun, and it's exciting, and it's futures. So one of the things in the Cabinet Office, and with all large organisations, is this temptation towards creating silos. And silos really make a lot of sense when you know what you're doing. They're about efficiency, they're about getting stuff done. And you obviously had a chance to see that. But okay, what happens is you end up with a gap between silos where people's needs aren't being met and where problems aren't always clear. And so I'm interested in the fuzzy line that operates between the liminal space, if you like, between these silos operations, and also when silos have become redundant. And, you know, they were fit for purpose when they were created, but how do you then decommission, how do you build new systems to speak to new challenges? As Jack said, the big sustainable development goals, for example. Musical interlude. So some of you will have read Roger Martin's work on this, where he describes organisations like McDonald's about being, in effect, optimisation organisations. How can you make chicken nuggets in the most efficient way? But when you switch from chicken nuggets to a new product, you have to kind of take a whole new process. And so he describes this process of going from mystery, like you only make burgers, you've never made nuggets, into heuristic, how can we make nuggets, i.e. something you eat in a car, through to the algorithm, and then how can we scale nugget production globally? And in effect, a lot of our problems, as we were saying earlier, are in this mystery space now. If you're building a bridge, we've built a lot of bridges, we know how to build bridges, you get it wrong, that's dumb failure. But if you're doing something that's never been done before, next practice, and it's complex and it's fuzzy, then you've got no reference points, and therefore you're in the mystery space. So how do we go from mystery to sense-making to delivery? That's, you know, designers do this all the time. So it won't surprise you that when we talk about, for example, in the Policy Lab process, we use the double diamond. I trademarked it back in 2005, 2006, and at that time it was just a sketch on a flip chart. We genuinely had no idea that anyone would pay attention to it. In fact, we, at that point, had no intention to share even our inner workings in the Design Council with anyone else. And so it amazes me as much as anyone else, I think, that such a simple sort of image, if you like, and mental model for change has captured the imagination of so many around the world. And so this is our latest version of it, just if that's of interest. One of the things we need to do in government is to really focus on evidence. So the standard of evidence is much higher within government than anything I've experienced in design consultancy. You cannot, and actually should not, experiment on the country at scale with people's lives, with things that matter, unless you're absolutely sure that the evidence will take you in that direction. But as I was saying before, you can't just rely on evidence, you also have to think about next practice and stuff that we haven't done before. So how do you bring innovation and evidence together? So our first phase is really looking at the culture, behaviours, knowledge, information and data that we already have. So really digging deep. And some of that's ethnographical and going out in the world and getting big data, and some of that is pure, understanding of analysis of the numbers, big data, data science. And you see in this diagram, I've kind of added a layer here, which is just more for my mindset, really, which is between the shadow culture and the visible culture. Because a lot of our change, the magic of our change, operates in the shadow culture. It's not always explicit. So our techniques try to elicit and reassure and build trust such that you can tap into that shadow culture. The things people actually do versus the things that they say they do. And we've all been in meetings where people have a lovely, wonderful meeting, very polite, and then you go out and they go, well, that wasn't the real thing. The real thing is this. And I've certainly seen it over and over in government, and you get it with clients, and you get it more broadly in life. So how can we tap into the shadow culture so we're really dealing with the issues that are at play and not the sort of theatre of how organisations work? And then also at this end, we're interested in, this is an adaptation of the futures cone, if you're familiar with that, from speculative design. But here we have dystopian and utopian futures. So rather than heading singularly to one single solution, expanding those possibilities to say, let's look at an array, let's look at what's possible, plausible, probable, desirable, but let's also consider both the positive and negative futures. And actually, in our experience, a lot of the negative futures drive change rather than the positive. Everyone's sort of immune, if you like, to these positive visions of the future where we're all going to be in flying taxis and the world is going to be sunshine. Some of the negative visions that we've been working on actually have encouraged people to pay attention, and Sanjan will talk about a specific project where we've been doing that. So this is our double diamond, and you'll see this kind of algorithm process going through it. So as Roger Martin was saying, this is the space of mystery, and then you start to cluster things up, you start to make these into chunks, into heuristics of trying and testing and getting your hands dirty, which is classic design practice, building stuff out in the world, and then once you've figured out what's what, you can then prioritise and decide which option you're going to go with. So super simple, and really kind of that's where our thinking is in terms of the lab at the moment. The screen's gone off again, so if you do want me to keep with it, you'll have to probably just keep it alive. Okay, no, it's fine. So what does this mean? So I'm just going to dance through a few different thoughts around systems change, some of the issues, some of the kind of key points. The first one, some of you, or many of you may be aware of, that fascinates me, is the notion of boundary rituals. And for those who aren't familiar with this, the boundary ritual is what happens between certainties or dualisms. So, for example, a classic boundary ritual between night and day. So we know about night, we know about day. What happens between is this kind of awkward liminal space. And so what often happens with boundary rituals, if you talk to communication studies people, is they get too much meaning. They're neither one thing or another, and therefore there's too much meaning. And then we start to put in all sorts of kind of fantasy and so for example, between night and day we have twilight. And then it's no coincidence that twilight is when vampires come out. And So in these liminal spaces between boundaries, we start to add loads of rituals, or we add stories and they're often either mystical or they're dangerous, and they're kind of it's quite an interesting space to think about. So the other boundary rituals you'll be familiar with. You meet someone, you can't just meet them, because that's the moment between not knowing them and knowing them. So we have a boundary ritual, which is we shake hands, we kiss, we hug, but obviously you also get all those awkward moments when you don't know whether you should be kissing or you should be hugging, or in the UK often you kiss on each cheek, or do you do 3 or 4? Do you get it wrong? Do you go the wrong way? I've done that and actually kissed a colleague on the lips, So these boundary rituals are fraught with danger as well. Classic other ones, you get married, so you have a wedding. A wedding is a boundary ritual. You graduate from university, you'll have a ceremony. So there are a lot of ceremonies and ceremonial things. So when we think about how we want to change the world, can we as designers build boundary rituals that are not dangerous but that are pleasurable, so that change becomes much more meaningful? And maybe there's something about living with those differences as well. So things like when you're in or out of office, we could have quite a lot of fun with thinking about the different boundaries. Another thought really, I think, is around using change to create change. I often can be found to say this, which is the metaphor I think of when I think about this is based around Earth tectonics. So there is a moment, so if you're in an earthquake environment, there is a moment when you go from solid state to a future solid state. So you're still in this boundary ritual, but this time the metaphor is more earth-based. And in between those two states is called liquefaction. And it's when actual solid rock becomes liquid. And then it becomes solid again. And I think one of the things that when you're a change agent, you need to spot is the moment when organisations and when opportunities are in their liquid state, not in their solid state. And we think the world is just a constant state, which it clearly isn't. Well, it might be, actually, when I think about it that way. So this is the idea of using change to create change. Those moments of liquefaction are huge opportunities, but they're also disorientating for people. And so again, as wayfinders, as designers, we can actually be in there helping people change, using the complexity of change to create the energy for more change. And I just put this figure in really about thinking about silos, where I started. I mean, this is the percentage of staff in the UK government who move. And they move across different departments and so on. And there's a real sort of uptake of kind of generalists moving around and people leaving their departments and moving. So there's an opportunity as people move around organisations that you might bring a fresh perspective. We all know the studies that say that when people move house, that's a prime moment to get them to change behaviour. You can get them on buses, you can get them recycling. That moving house is a liquefaction moment. It's also a boundary ritual, right? So you can make moving house the thing, and then you've got an opportunity for change. And in many ways, I think silos are a bit like phone boxes. There could be a curiosity from a bygone era. Or maybe we need these silos more than ever to actually help us function. This is back at the Law Courts of Justice in London. It amuses me when I go around London that we still have these phone boxes. Their only function now is to have tourists stand in front and be photographed. But they're still there. No one actually uses them for phone calls. So how many of these technologies and legacies, I mean, at one stage, these are the white heat of new technology. These were exciting. And now we're like, they're a legacy, but they're still there. They hang around. And we've got that in our organisations, stuff that hangs around, even though it's entirely redundant. And yet maybe we're nostalgic about it. We want to keep it just because it's familiar and it gives us a nice warm feeling, even if it doesn't actually serve any purpose. Shelter from the rain, yeah. I mean, some people have turned these into libraries, they've turned them into little social clubs. There's even one, I think, near me in Cornwall, which is a disco. It's the world's smallest disco. It's got little lights in it. They're amazing. They're made out of solid teak. They're incredible pieces of engineering. So, just thinking forward in terms of what does this mean for you as individuals and as you as change agents? Everyone's familiar with Buckminster Fuller, right? So, yes, no, anyone not familiar with Buckminster Fuller? Okay, so one. And for those who kind of nodded, even though you're not really sure where I'm going with this, Buckminster Fuller had like grand designs. He had, he designed the geodesic dome. He was a kind of revolutionary designer, wanted to change the world. He also helped people get perspective on the Earth and see the Earth as this kind of Gaia, as this fragile space. And then he also designed some kind of diaxon cars. And so he was a real future thinker and radical. And on his gravestone, does anyone know what it says on his gravestone? I think Sarah does, because I told her yesterday. But anyone else? No? It says, "Call me Trim Tab." So what's a trim tab? And why would you have "Call me Trim Tab" written as engraved on your gravestone? Anyone know what trim tab is? Say again? They are on aircraft wings. They're also on boats. So if you have a container ship and you want it to move, now this is a metaphor you can start to imagine, right? You've got this huge organisation, you want it to move. How do you make a container ship move? Well, the rudder, of course. But the rudder can't move because the water tension is too great. It's a huge, huge thing, and it needs to move against a really strong body of water. So the trim tab is a secondary rudder. It's really thin, and it runs down the back of the main rudder. And the trim tab moves first. And what the trim tab does is it breaks the tension of the water, that enables the rudder to move, that enables the ship to shift. And so, in a sense, Buckminster Fuller felt that he was a trim tab. He was the bit that moved, the small, tiny bit that then created the massive change in the world. And it kind of, I like it as a metaphor because it reminds us that all change is about people, and all change is about small changes first, and whether it's, you know, Greta or Gandhi, they had no actual technical power. You know, they weren't at the front of the ship driving the ship. And yet they have exerted disproportionate influence on the whole system by moving as a trim tab. So that the sort of takeaway from this perhaps is how can you be more like trim tab in organisations or as a catalyst working with clients, so on. And so really we think of change as being hard and heavy and, you know, heavy lifting and resistance, but maybe we should be thinking of change in a much more fluid way. So fish have an effect known as quorum sensing, and it's a collective intelligence. So when fish shoal, they're applying this quorum sensing, which is scientists have understood to be a form of collective intelligence, where you actually take those individual trim tabs and you start to operate as a shoal. And of course, there's that classic quote where fish would never invent water, because when you're surrounded by something, you can't see it. And so, you know, the idea maybe my metaphor is stretching us to the idea that designers are fish. and we need to shoal around these big social issues, but also we need to reveal the water that is around us all that we can't see, and help people then navigate that. So I think I have I've got about 5 minutes I'm going to do, and then I'm going to hand it to Sanjan. 2? I'll do 2 minutes then. So I'll finish on some thoughts around working beyond these boundaries. Because these boundaries, as I said before, are really there for good reason. But how do we organise ourselves in new ways such that we can be effective and legitimate? If you're not legitimate, you don't have any agency, but also make change happen. And I'm sure you're familiar with this idea of the hippo. Yes, people have heard of the hippo? So this is that decision-making in large organisations comes down to hippos, who are the highest person's opinion. So whoever is the most senior person in the room, they get to choose. This is classic hierarchical leadership, and it works in silos, and it gets stuff done. But it gets stuff done efficiently, as I said at the start, based on known problems. Our problems are very different now, and so therefore, thinking maybe, and I made this up, so this isn't a thing, we should be operating like polos. So you take the pyramid and you flatten it. I actually couldn't put an acronym out of donuts, which is my original ambition for this diagram. So polos is kind of closest as I could get. People open to learning opportunities and tapping into the curiosity of all parts of the system, whether it's young or older people within the workforce, and using an adaptive form of leadership. If anyone wants to come up with an acronym using the word donut, that will definitely make it to my next talk. So the other thing to say on this is that I think it's a shift in mindset as well. So it's not just about being competitive in a scarcity model. Like if I am ruthless, I can knock everyone out of the competition and I will make it to the top, and then I will be the highest paid person, and then I make all the decisions. To an abundance model where when we work as a network, we can actually all create change and effect. And I think this also plays into what we're talking about, moving from centralised systems to decentralised systems. So like this is a classic thing between UX and service design. Like they're similar, but they're different. So they turn in, you get these horizontal hostility, which is a phenomenon. And so how can we move from these effective but kind of sometimes conflicting tribes into collectivism? So the way I think of that, and my final kind of departing thought really, is if you have all these filings on the table and each of them represents different individuals and organisations, how can we almost like use these grand challenges like the Sustainable Development Goals as a magnet that draws everyone into orientating in a particular direction? So you stay in your organisations, you don't move around, but you are orientated towards a common goal. And so that's where we're at. We're trying to help departments and organisations inside and outside government to orientate themselves towards big issues that matter whether it's climate emergency or whether it's a more inclusive society, and in doing so, help people work in new ways across boundaries.